I still remember the weight of that pen in my hand, how it trembled just slightly as my daughter Sarah placed those papers before me on the kitchen table where we'd shared 1,000 meals together. The afternoon light was filtering through the lace curtains I'd hung 40 years ago, the same ones that had watched my children grow from babies to adults, and now here I was, 73 years old, being told that these were just medical papers, just formalities, just things that needed my signature so they could help me better. Sarah's voice was so sweet, so reassuring, the way it used to be when she was young and would promise me she'd cleaned her room when I knew very well she'd just shoved everything under the bed. But this wasn't about messy rooms anymore. This was about my life, my home, my everything, though I didn't know it yet. My hands have always been steady, even in my old age, the hands that raised 3 children alone after my husband Thomas passed 20 years ago, the hands that worked double shifts at the diner to keep food on the table, that wiped away tears and braided hair and signed report cards and held grandchildren for the first time. But that day, those hands shook. Something in my gut twisted with an instinct I should have listened to, a whisper that said slow down, read carefully, don't just trust because they're your blood. But Sarah was smiling, and her husband Mark was nodding encouragingly from across the room, and their lawyer friend was there too, some man in an expensive suit who kept looking at his watch like my time wasn't worth much to him. They told me it was about healthcare proxies, about making sure someone could make medical decisions if I ever couldn't, about protecting me. The word protecting should have been my first clue, because I'd spent my entire life protecting them, and now suddenly I needed protecting from what, exactly? I signed the first page without reading it thoroughly, then the second, and I was about to sign the third when something made me pause. Maybe it was the way Mark shifted his weight, or how Sarah suddenly became very interested in her fingernails, or how the lawyer cleared his throat in that impatient way people do when they want something over with quickly. I adjusted my reading glasses, the cheap ones from the drugstore because I'd never spent money on myself when it could go to my children instead, and I actually read the words on that final page. Power of attorney. Irrevocable transfer of property. Legal guardianship with full financial control. The words swam before my eyes like fish in dark water, and I had to read them twice, then 3 times, before the meaning crashed into me like a wave I never saw coming. This wasn't about medical decisions. This was about taking everything. My house, the one Thomas and I bought when we were newlyweds with nothing but dreams and determination, where we brought each of our babies home, where I'd kissed scraped knees and celebrated graduations and held my husband's hand on the porch swing until his very last day. My bank accounts, modest as they were, but mine, earned through decades of work that broke my back but never my spirit. My independence, my dignity, my right to live in my own home and make my own choices. They wanted it all, wrapped up with legal language and delivered with smiles and lies about my own good. I looked up at Sarah, my firstborn, the little girl I'd rocked to sleep singing lullabies, who I'd taught to read and to be kind and to always tell the truth, and I saw a stranger wearing my daughter's face. How long had they planned this, I wondered. How many conversations had they had about poor old Mom, about how she was getting forgetful even though I wasn't, about how that house was worth so much money sitting there wasted on just one old woman, about how they deserved it more than I needed it. Mark wouldn't meet my eyes. The lawyer was already packing up his briefcase, assuming the deal was done. Sarah's expression had changed now that she saw I was actually reading, a flash of something crossing her face that looked like anger mixed with fear, like I'd caught her stealing cookies, but the stakes were so much higher than cookies now. My voice, when I finally found it, came out stronger than I expected. I told them no. Just that one word, but it carried 7 decades of life behind it, of surviving things they couldn't imagine, of being underestimated and overlooked and counted out, only to rise again every single time. I told them I knew exactly what these papers meant, that I wasn't senile or confused or in need of their protection, and that they should be ashamed of themselves. Sarah tried to argue, her voice rising with justifications about my age and my health and how they were just trying to plan ahead, how I was being difficult and ungrateful after everything they'd done for me. Everything they'd done for me. As if I hadn't given them everything I had and more, as if the debt flowed in their direction instead of mine. I didn't sign that final page. I stood up from my kitchen table with whatever dignity I had left wrapped around me like armor, and I asked them to leave my house. The lawyer left first, muttering something about wasting his time. Mark followed, but Sarah lingered, and for just a moment I saw tears in her eyes, and I wanted so desperately to believe they were tears of shame and remorse, but I think they might have been tears of frustration that their plan had failed. She said I was making a mistake, that I'd regret this, that I was pushing away the only family I had. And then she left too, and the house fell into a silence so complete it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat back down at that table and I cried for the first time in years, really cried, the kind of crying that comes from somewhere deep in your chest and tears you apart from the inside. I cried for the daughter I thought I'd raised, for the trust that had been broken, for the loneliness that stretched out before me like an empty road with no destination. I called my son Michael that evening, my middle child who lived 3 states away and who I hadn't wanted to burden because he had his own young family to care for. I told him everything, my voice shaking with anger and hurt and betrayal. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then he said 4 words that changed everything again. He said, "I'm coming home." Michael arrived 2 days later with his wife Jennifer and their 2 little ones, and they filled my house with noise and life and the kind of love I'd forgotten could exist without conditions attached. He sat with me and went through all my papers, helped me find a real lawyer, not some friend of Sarah's who was in on the scheme, and we made sure everything was properly protected and documented. We set up a legitimate healthcare proxy, a real will, protections that actually served my interests instead of someone else's greed. And then Michael said something I'll never forget. He said that I could come live with them, that they had room and would be honored to have me, but that if I wanted to stay in my house, in my home, then he'd make sure I could do that safely for as long as I wanted. I chose to stay. This house holds too many memories, too many pieces of Thomas and the life we built together, too many mornings watching the sun rise over the garden he planted and too many evenings on that porch swing remembering the sound of his laugh. Sarah called a few times in the weeks that followed, her tone alternating between apologetic and accusatory, never quite able to commit to either genuine remorse or honest admission of what she'd tried to do. I kept the conversations short. I told her I loved her because she's still my daughter, but that trust, once broken so completely, doesn't just heal because someone says they're sorry. She'd shown me who she was in that moment when she thought I was too old or too trusting to notice what she was taking from me. Michael visits often now, every few weeks, and he calls me twice a day just to chat about nothing and everything. His children know my stories, the real ones about their grandfather and the diner and the hard years and the good years all mixed together the way life actually is. My youngest, David, heard about everything through Michael and drove up from Florida to see me, spending a weekend just sitting with me, holding my hand, telling me he was sorry he hadn't been more present. I told him the same thing I'm telling you now, that life has a way of showing you people's true faces when the stakes get high enough, and that sometimes the greatest gift we receive is the clarity to see what's really there instead of what we wish was there. I'm 73 years old, and I almost signed away everything that mattered because someone I loved and trusted asked me to without reading carefully. I think about that afternoon often, about how close I came to losing not just my house and my money, but my dignity, my autonomy, my right to live out my days on my own terms. I think about what would have happened if I'd signed that final page, if I'd trusted blindly the way we're taught to trust family, if I hadn't listened to that small voice inside that told me to read just one more time. They say blood is thicker than water, but I learned that day that sometimes blood runs cold, and that the family you choose through their actions means more than the family you're born into through mere biology. The pen sits in the drawer now, that same pen, and sometimes I look at it and remember. I remember the weight of almost making the biggest mistake of my life. I remember the feeling of those words revealing themselves to me like a curtain pulled back on a stage I never knew I was standing on. And I remember the strength it took to say no, to stand up, to refuse to be diminished or dismissed or quietly shuffled aside because I'd grown old and someone else decided that made me disposable. I'm still here, in my house, living my life, making my own choices, drinking my morning coffee from Thomas's favorite mug and watching the seasons change through windows I've looked through for 40 years. Sarah doesn't visit, and maybe she never will again, and that knowledge sits heavy in my chest like a stone I'll carry until I die. But I'm free, and I'm whole, and I'm exactly where I choose to be, and that final page remains unsigned, a monument to the moment I chose myself, even when it meant losing someone I'd loved from the very first moment I held her in my arms and counted her tiny fingers and promised her everything I had to give, never imagining she'd one day try to take even more than that.